I'm really excited to welcome Murray Hiebert to today's Brown Bag, which will be the last one of the semester. We've had a very dynamic session of Brown Bags this semester with people from all over the world zooming in. Murray is currently a senior associate of the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C. And he has recently completed a book about China's involvement in Southeast Asia, which we will be hearing about today. I'm especially excited to have him here today because it brings me back to my first year in graduate school at Cornell when I was just beginning my academic study of Vietnam. I've been working in Vietnam for over 20 years now, but back then in the Kroc Library at Cornell, his book, Chasing the Tigers, A Portrait of the New Vietnam, which was published in 1996, built from his firsthand observations in the early 1990s when he was based in Hanoi and writing for the Far Eastern Economic Review, which at that time, those of you who've been studying Southeast Asia for a long time, was one of the most important sources of serious journalism for all of Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia as well. Some of you probably remember our own recently retired colleague, Nayan Chanda, who also worked for the Far Eastern Economic Review. And like Nayan, Murray Hiebert was part of an important cohort of embedded journalists who were offering on-the-ground reporting of Vietnam during important post-war periods. And his Vietnam books are especially important for the portraits they offer of the early 1990s, when some of the changes associated with Vietnam's Doi Moi period and the post-socialist reforms were beginning to come into effect. And it was a time when society in Vietnam was rapidly transforming economically, politically, and socially. And Murray Hiebert was one of the few people who was really on the ground writing about all those transformations. It's been more than 20 years since I first read that book in Cornell's library, and I'm really eager to be able to meet Murray for the first time and to hear what he has to say about China's involvement in Southeast Asia. So please join me in welcoming Murray Hiebert to our Zoom edition Brown Bag series. His talk today, like his newly published book, is entitled Under Beijing's Shadow, Southeast Asia's China Challenge. Murray?
Great. Thanks a lot for that kind introduction, Eric. And you've really flashed me back to the old days. Those were the days, actually, in journalism in Southeast Asia, or in a lot of parts of Asia, because foreign journalists there was quite a few of them, and we had quite a few outlets. In the Far Eastern Economic Review, I was lucky to be working for them, and they provided a lot of the early reporting that was coming out of countries like Vietnam that was going through a transition. Now, of course, the media has really shrunk down the number of journalists. The Far Eastern Economic Review no longer exists. It died in 2004. It was owned by Dow Jones that really didn't feel like they could carry it anymore when advertising was getting hammered. Yeah, so this, my new book is about, like you said, how Southeast Asia is responding to China's rise. So what I'll do is I'll try to give maybe in about half our time here, give an overview of the key themes of the book. I'll try to intersperse examples from different countries because one thing that is quite clear when you start doing this research and writing is that Southeast Asian countries are all responding to China very differently, depending on how big they are, how close they are to China, their politics, those kinds of dynamics. And their history with China is also very important. But it's fair to say that all the countries really do respond to China, see China as both a challenge and an opportunity. The opportunity is that they think China is going to yank them up by their bootstraps and help their economies develop, which is in fact true. All the countries have benefited immensely. And then the challenge is a considerable concern about what it means for their sovereignty going forward, especially the countries on the border of China, which is Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. So I go through, I do it country by country. That's not always the most creative way to do it, but where you try to go with themes and it really doesn't work because the themes are so different. The issues you need to cover in each country is so different. But I do look at China's different tools that it brings. Like it brings soft power, including economic cooperation, cultural exchanges, Mandarin language training, more hard power that includes threats in the South China Sea, economic pressures on countries that don't do what China wants, and as well as military sales and military exchanges. And sometimes it even gets into considerably sharper power, like especially dealing with its communist neighbor, biggest communist neighbor immediately to the south, Vietnam, with which it has had considerable disputes for decades, but really in the recent years, a lot of pressure on Vietnam's oil and gas exploration. I'll get into that later. The economic cooperation, as I mentioned, has really exploded. China's two-way trade with the 10 countries of Southeast Asia was 60 billion last year. Excuse me, 600 billion last year, which is double the US trade figures with the region. And it's up tremendously since China started opening up in the late 70s and early 80s. A lot of the economic benefit also comes from tourism. It's hard to get accurate numbers, but there were an estimated 60 million Chinese tourists that visited the Southeast Asian countries last year. That's obviously going to be down tremendously this year because of COVID. The numbers will be really small, and it really is hurting countries that rely on tourism, like Thailand, for example. And then the other big way that countries look to China is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is China's big signature economic development project that it's looking to build globally railroads and dams and highways and bridges and power stations and you name it. They even include free trade agreements or trade agreements in the Belt and Road. But China has really had trouble. It's had real difficulties getting this thing off the road. Off the ground. Every situation is really complex. Even tiny Laos that agreed to build a railroad negotiated for 5 years. You wouldn't have thought that they would be able to stand up to China for 5 years, but they were negotiating over the interest rates and how much Laos would contribute. China starts by wanting you to pay for your whole project yourself. And Laos, that would have been half their GDP. And so they really fought back. China also wants land on both sides of the railroad so that they can, their business people can make money. And finally, they did agree, but the railroad is now cranking along. It'll be finished. It was to be finished at the end of next year, but it might slip into 2022 because of the slowdown resulting from COVID. Thailand, which needs to build the next railroad so this thing keeps moving back all the way from Kunming to Singapore, has been negotiating since 2014, when China thought with the coup government, the Prayut government they would be really interested in doing this because they were getting a lot of isolation. They were getting some sanctions and other pressure from the US and the European Union. But the Thais and the Chinese have had over 30 rounds of talks, and they still haven't agreed. And there, the negotiations are over slightly more complicated issues than they were in Laos. The the Thais say, well, we don't need your money. Chinese money is not cheap. They start usually from the Exim Bank, the Export Import Bank, or the China Development Bank, usually start around 4.5%. These are both money-making institutions. They're not aid organizations, let's say like US Exim or Japanese Exim. So the Thais said, well, we don't need that. We don't need money. We can get money on the international market. They also said, we don't need your engineers. China likes to send lots of workers. We don't need your engineers. We got a lot of engineers of our own, and we don't necessarily want your technology. We, there's German and there's Japanese and other technology. And so they're still fussing around over this. I don't know what's going to happen. They did finally agree on building a 2.5 kilometer, get this, 2.5 kilometers out of several hundred kilometers as a pilot project. And then in Indonesia, they also built a railroad, but it's the high-speed train from Jakarta to Bandung. It's about 150 kilometers. There, the thing is also moving slowly since 2015 when it was agreed upon, partially because of the difficulties that Chinese companies and their Indonesian partners have in getting land. So really, absolutely every place. And then actually there's Myanmar is also another interesting example. You would think that after Myanmar, the Aung San Suu Kyi government was involved in kicking out the Rohingya in 2017 and early 2018, resulted in a lot of isolation. And from the West, you would think they would want to move ahead with China, but China has been negotiating over the Chakpu Dam, which is on the western side of Myanmar on the Indian Ocean. China has two pipelines, an oil and a gas pipeline leading there already, but they want to also build a port and a big port that some people suspect has dual use, meaning civilian and military. And the Myanmar has held them off, and finally they have renegotiated repeatedly and scaled it back, and still they have no work has started on it. And the same is true with the Myanmar, the China-Myanmar economic corridor, which is to lead from Kunming down to several major cities in Myanmar. And include roads and railroads. And Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, was there 2 years ago and really put a lot of pressure on them to get going. Nothing happened. They had elections a few weeks ago, and Xi just called Aung San Suu Kyi again this week and said, you got to get cranking. But Myanmar really is almost as nationalistic as the Vietnamese. And so it is tough for China to get much going there as well. We don't know exactly how much China has invested in the Belt and Road in Southeast Asia, but there's a consulting company in Washington called RWR Associates, and they estimate the number at about 200 million in the 5 years after 2013. But having visited the countries and visited a lot of projects in the 2 years, 2018-19, that I was writing the book, I really think that number is pretty high. Some projects also get bogged down in, sorry, I'm spending a lot of time on this, but this is really a signature Chinese project. And it's good to know that despite the coverage you get in the Chinese media, that this thing is not cranking along by any means. The previous Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, signed an agreement to build the East Coast Rail Link, but he was defeated in an election in May of 2018, and his successor was Mahathir Mohamad 2.0. He came back after once running the country for 20 years and then leaving for a while. He was reelected, and he put a stop to it just because he thought China had overcharged. He thought that there was a lot of kickbacks going to Najib and to Najib's very distressed state investment company known as One Malaysia Development Berhad, or one MDB. Um, and they eventually, China agreed to negotiate, but the trial, Najib has been is still under trial for some of the corruption that was spin-off of this project and others that China was involved in or were domestic projects. And we could go on in that vein, but I'm going to get going here on some other themes. Well, I should say just one more thing. If you push back, as the Lao proved, as Malaysia proved, if you push back against projects, even once they're going, you can get China to renegotiate. They have been somewhat reasonable in showing flexibility and willingness to compromise. For some countries, cooperating too much with China is very controversial domestically. Last year in 2019, Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, as he's known for short, was running again for president of Indonesia. And he has relied a lot on China for infrastructure projects beyond the one that I mentioned, the high-speed rail from Jakarta to Bandung. And he got a lot of criticisms from his challengers for depending too much on China. And I'll get back to Indonesia. Indonesia has a unique set of attitudes toward China, dating back to 1965, when China has been accused of being involved in supporting a coup against Sukarno, who was then the president. The other area in which China is very involved, and this is probably much more successful, is in the so-called digital Silk Road. So that's the digital economy. China is very active in investing in unicorns, the startups worth over $1 billion, e-commerce, various e-payment schemes. Huawei in Southeast Asia is very active in 5G. You may remember that President Trump has been very much opposed to Huawei being involved in 5G in the US, and has got many friends and allies in Europe and Australia, New Zealand to shun Huawei out of fear that that their technology will be used to spy on the local population. But these companies like Huawei are also involved in artificial intelligence, facial recognition. In the Singapore airport, you have facial recognition, and that's been produced by I think it is Huawei. But Chinese firms like Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com are also investing billions in startups like Gojek, the motorcycle Uber kind of thing, a company. It's broader than that, but that's how it sort of started. Tokopedia, Traveloka, and various Chinese fintech companies are also very active in Indonesia. About 2/3 of China's investment in the e-commerce and the digital space is in Indonesia and Singapore. I guess that makes sense. Indonesia is the biggest country with 160, 170 million people, and Singapore is by far the wealthiest. There's only two countries that are shunning Huawei, and that is, not surprisingly, Eric, Vietnam, as you probably know, is not terribly enthusiastic and has shunned Huawei. And Singapore, for 5G, is giving the biggest contracts to Ericsson and Nokia, but is giving Huawei some minor roles. The ethnic Chinese, there are, we don't know exactly how many, but probably about 2% of Southeast Asia's population is ethnic Chinese. Many of them came over the centuries, including at the end of the Qing dynasty. They came to Southeast Asia mostly in search of economic opportunities. They came to places like Malaysia to aid the British colonial effort, helped with rubber and palm and tin oil, tin oil, in tin mining operations. So but then they started to play over the years a much greater role in the economy. So they're play quite a big role. The thing that really stunned me, though, was the new migration, which I don't think Beijing has anything to do with, but you're seeing increasing numbers of Chinese come into Southeast Asia. The places where you see the most of them are in northern Myanmar, north of Mandalay, and northern Laos, where they are involved in plantations, rubber, bananas, watermelons, green beans, pumpkins, just an awful lot of agricultural and industrial agricultural products, creating a lot of tensions in the region because they use a lot of chemical pesticides and chemical fertilizer, which is polluting the rivers and causing draft animals and to die. Then they also move into some cities. There are quite a few. Obviously, there were a lot in Sihanoukville, in Cambodia, especially until the end of last year, when China and got Hun Sen, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, to agree to end online gaming and a lot of casino gambling. But there's also quite a large number of ethnic Chinese moving to Manila. And then the guys who left Sihanoukville after the clampdown on gaming, they moved to Cayenne or Karen state in Myanmar, and they set up casinos there, Shui Koko being one of the more famous ones. So I guess I'm a little bit concerned that long term, the ethnic population in northern Myanmar and northern Laos can have a huge cultural and political impact in those parts of those two countries in particular. The history of China with Southeast Asia obviously goes back for millennia. China once controlled northern Vietnam as a colonial power for almost a thousand years, but after the communists took over in 1949, the Communist Party supported communist forces against most of the governments that were all establishing themselves after the end of World War II, when many of them got independence from their European colonial masters. And this period when China was supporting domestic communists, it still remains a legacy in many of these countries today. So this is what is one of the challenges for Jokowi and other leaders in Indonesia, that many people still are convinced that China was involved in a coup in which hundreds of thousands of people in the end got killed. And there's a lot of fear that China may still be involved politically. Jokowi himself, the first time he ran for power, he was a mayor of Solo, a little town in Java. He was accused of being both a Christian and an ethnic Chinese, and he's pretty clearly Indonesian to Javanese, who's a Muslim. But the people the charging people with being Chinese is often a weapon you can use against them, and that's what happened to the mayor who replaced Jokowi in Jakarta. He was ethnic Chinese. His nickname was Ahok. He was ethnic Chinese and a Christian, and he got nailed with allegations of blasphemy for when he tried to tell a joke about Muslims, and it did not go over very well at all. Opinion polls, they're tough to figure out how popular China is, but the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore does annual surveys, and the survey that came out in January, these are elite polls where they ask officials and academics and business people and journalists and NGO people to give their views. And the poll that came out in January had 79% of Southeast Asians saying China had the most economic influence in the region. About only 8% thought that about the United States. But even more surprising was that 52% said China was the most politically and strategically influential in Southeast Asia, and only 27%, about half, thought that about the United States. But if they were forced to choose between China and the US, which of course Southeast Asia doesn't want to do, but 46% chose China, 54% chose the United States, which is pretty close, actually. China has really stepped up military to military ties. And in recent years, it's sold some arms to some countries, particularly Thailand. Since the coup has purchased, the 2014 coup purchased some tanks. It ordered some submarines. Malaysia has had some coastal patrol vessels purchased from China. Myanmar and Cambodia also get quite a bit of military hardware from China. Some countries like Indonesia are occasionally look to buy more, but really in the end they haven't. China is also stepping up its military exercises, still way behind where the US is in terms of frequency and size. They also offered to do some training, but that also of Southeast Asian officers and Chinese military schools, but it's still way behind what the US does. China is really very big in soft power. It provides just oodles of scholarships. And I say oodles because it's really hard to get numbers on total numbers for Southeast Asia. But in 2016, there were almost 70,000 Southeast Asians studying in China. By far the biggest number was the Thais, 23,000, followed by Indonesians, 15,000. Vietnam, I think, was 11 or 12,000, which is still pretty high. China has also been very busy setting up Confucius Institutes, which provide Mandarin language training. There's about 30 now in the region. Half of them, 15 are in Thailand, 5 in Malaysia, 2 in the Philippines, 1 in Vietnam. And they're also inviting many more people from Southeast Asia to come visit. This includes party officials, not only from communist countries, but also from Malaysia and Indonesia. They invite party officials. PDIP, which is Jokowi's party, his party sends officials for training in terms of about how you do budgets, how you recruit new members, that kind of stuff. It's not Marxist-Leninist training. Duterte, President Duterte of the Philippines, his what's it, oh boy, I'm forgetting the name of his party right now, the acronym, but his party also sends people party leaders to China. Lots of journalists, lots of religious leaders. They really are China since the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang has become more high profile globally, has invited a lot of Muslims, Muslim leaders, imams to visit Xinjiang. many of them come back very positive, speaking very positively. So like a work camp atmosphere where they can pray 5 times a day, they can eat halal food, etc. Some are so positive that the Chinese ambassador will visit, as happened in the case of one village in Java and in Indonesia, and he offered to build them a new irrigation system, thanks to the imam's very positive, effusive description of how the Uyghurs are treated. China, I really worked hard at trying to figure out the level of Chinese political influence. You do see some examples, but it's not nearly as obvious as it is in Australia or New Zealand. In the 2018 elections in Malaysia, the Chinese ambassador, he actually went and campaigned for some of the ruling party officials, the UMNO and the Malaysia Chinese Association officials. They actually did quite poorly and lost the election. In from about the mid 2016 to mid 2017, China and Singapore were at. China was in the middle of let's isolate Singapore campaign, partially because the prime minister had urged China to follow the rule of law in response to the UN arbitral tribunal that the Philippines had brought, ruling overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines. China went ballistic and started really. Singapore is the biggest investor in China, and really started putting pressure. China put pressure on businessmen. If you want to keep operating here, you will have to get your government to change policy, which really, should I say, really irritated the Singapore government, and they didn't really respond to the businessmen's lobby, I guess. China is also very active in fishing and hacking, and Vietnam, despite the fact that it might be a communist ally, technically, quote unquote, is often the brunt of it. When Vietnam was going to host the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in 2017, that was going to be attended by both Xi and Trump. China hacked pretty badly. They often use phishing techniques where they get officials to open certain software that then goes into malware that goes into their computers, and they give a dump of their negotiating strategy. The Chinese also regularly look for Vietnam strategy in the South China Sea, try to figure out what the party is saying about that. And then ahead of the completion of the negotiations for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was just signed, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Chinese also hacked into Vietnam's system quite a bit. Indonesian officials in the elections in 2019 charged both the Chinese and Russians with hacking into their voter lists. The Chinese hacked into Sing Health, where they downloaded just reams of documentation about the health conditions of various Singaporeans, including Prime Minister Lee. Some of that stuff irritates those Southeast Asians quite a bit, but they point out that China is not the only big power that's constantly spying on them, which I won't name that other big power. You probably know where you're sitting. And I'll conclude with some comments on water. I actually realized I'm going a lot longer than I thought. One of the concerns is what's happening on the Mekong. China has built 11 dams in the upper reaches of the Mekong, and then has helped build dams along the Mekong as we come through Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and into Vietnam. China, the water from China contributes about 25% or so of the water in the Mekong. And the Mekong is about, in Southeast Asia, in Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, and Vietnam, about 60 million people make their living along that, fishing and farming. The Mekong is one of the most fertile fishing sources in the world, and one of the biggest spawning areas for fish along the Mekong is the Tonle Sap, which is the lake in the middle of Cambodia that during rainy season explodes as a tributary of the Mekong, carries water up into the Tonle Sap and brings a lot of fish with it. And then in dry season, the water flows back down and moves the fish back into the Mekong main tributary. And in the Vietnam's Mekong Delta, the level of water matters a lot because the Mekong Delta is the breadbasket of Vietnam. It is also below sea level. So if it doesn't get water from the Mekong and silt all the way from Tibet, it can slip into the sea. And so what's happened the last 2 years as China has opened up really started running its 11 dams. The dam number 7 and dam number 11, those two hold enough water to fill the Chesapeake Bay. Just not terribly far from where you guys or I am sitting right now. And this has caused a lot of, because of water being, rain being less the last few years than it had been earlier, has caused severe drought. And so the agricultural crops are being damaged. A spawning of fish is being hurt, and the Mekong Delta in Vietnam is being hurt. So so that this has become a huge issue, and the Mekong countries have started to press China on this, but so far China has only said, they started by saying they also faced a drought. We now know that they didn't, in fact, because a group called Eyes on the Earth took satellite photos earlier this year, about 6 or 8 months ago, and found the massive quantities of water that I was referring to. And so the ASEANs started putting a lot of pressure on China. China has agreed to start giving them data on how much water they're holding. We'll have to see if the countries of Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam can exert more pressure so that China will be more accommodating. I don't know if I should, Eric, should I talk a little bit about the South China Sea, or do you think most people here know about the South China Sea and we can leave it for question and answer? Because I realize we have about 20 minutes left.
I'd say that if you just mention it briefly and then wrap it to a close, then we'll have time. And we can linger a little bit beyond the hour if you have time, but that's up to you. Some people will leave right at the hour, but I'm happy to stick around too.
Okay. Well, so I'll try to go over the South China Sea very quickly. I think that is something that is covered more in the news, and the U.S. government talks about it. But the South China Sea, and this is, maybe you asked me, Eric, if I was going to use a map, maybe it would have been useful to have a map of this. But the South China Sea has a big U-shaped line, dotted line in it, 9 dotted line, which is China's claims to about 80% of the South China Sea. It claims all the fish and the seafood and the hydrocarbons in that area, which is also where Vietnam, Philippines, and Malaysia, and to some extent Indonesia, which actually isn't a claimant. The claimant countries disputing with China are Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and Brunei. But part of the 9-dash line runs through northern Natuna, which is in the far northwestern part of Indonesia. In 2009, China's interest in the South China Sea is relatively recent. In 2009, countries, based on the UN Convention on Law of Sea, that was a deadline for countries to put in their claims. The main Southeast Asian countries put in their claims. China was really irritated at how much of their claims overlapped with those of China. In 2012, China took Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines, and a pretty dramatic move. The Philippines brought the case that I referred to earlier, and in 2013, 2016, the arbitral tribunal ruled against China. 2016 or 2015, boy, both dates stick in my head now, but ruled against China, and China went ballistic, ignored the ruling totally. It had earlier, as soon as the Philippines brought the case, started building artificial islands in the South China Sea, built up seven islands by dredging sand and grinding up coral, which is pretty bad because coral is a natural habitat for seafood. Four of the islands now have military landing strips, so military planes and radar and missile installations have been installed. It is now possible for China to fly from these bases to any capital in Southeast Asia. 2 years ago, China really did ramp up its pressure again and tried to press Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines to abandon some of their efforts to look for oil and gas. They started harassing big Chinese Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia vessels, began harassing exploration activities, and really made it clear, I think, to Southeast Asia, their Southeast Asian competitors, that you really should stop trying to develop these hydrocarbons off your coasts with foreign companies like Shell and Rosneft and Repsol, Rosneft being Russian, Repsol being Spanish, and either do it with us or do it by yourself. None of them can do it by themselves. So it's really created problems, especially for Vietnam and the Philippines, in terms of wanting to develop gas resources for making it possible for them to fire more power using gas rather than dirty coal burning technology that they have all gotten from China. And in the case of Malaysia, which is the second largest exporter of oil and gas, it is a major source of government revenue, but a quarter of the government's revenue comes from this. And so one doesn't quite know how this is all going to be resolved, but there is a lot of tension between these countries. The US regularly sails through there with so-called freedom of navigation exercises, which is intended to tell the Chinese, we don't accept your claims. Sometimes other countries have joined the US. Earlier this year, both Australia and Japan went along for a short sail through by American vessels. This is the one area, though, where the U.S. has been relatively quiet, but under Trump and beginning in August, Secretary of State Pompeo began very sharply criticizing the Chinese. It was part of a whole anti-China campaign that you might know. It deals with Taiwan, it deals with Hong Kong, it deals with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It deals with Huawei. It puts tariffs on various forms of Chinese trade because their U.S. is frustrated at Chinese stealing intellectual property rights and forcing U.S. companies to do technology transfer and those kinds of things. So the water, both the Mekong and the South China Sea, are two areas where it is quite possible for accidents, and that could lead into more conflict. and is the one area in which China has quite a black eye in, especially the maritime Southeast Asian countries. So I'm going to stop there, Eric, and let you turn to questions. Sorry, that went a little longer than I intended to.
Oh, Murray, no need to apologize. There's a lot to talk about, and you gave a really comprehensive coverage of so many issues with China's investment and interactions with Southeast Asia. So let's open it up to questions. At this point, anyone who has a question, if you can use in the participants tab of Zoom, there is a function to raise your hand. That's the easiest way to do it. And if you can't find that, just send a message to the chat and I'll note your name. We already have 2 hands up. We'll start with John Mitchell, I believe it is. And after that will be Greg Miller.
Thanks very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent presentation. Thank you for your time today. I have a quick question related to the Belt Road Initiative, particularly in Southeast Asia. Do you feel that the conditions could be created to make the Belt Road an enabling condition for sustainability? Building linear infrastructure, railroads, roads, high tension wires, you name it. I mean, all of that comes with an ecological cost, but there's a lot of science out there on how to do that stuff more sustainably. And I'm just wondering, in your opinion, do you think there is room for dialogue with China to talk about how to do that in a green way that actually makes it a win-win situation for all parties involved? Or is it really just about getting it done the cheapest way to make money for China and hope for the best for the other countries? I mean, do you have any opinion on that? Because I'd like to think that there was some hope and optimism for the former.
I think there's hope. It'll take some time. You may recall that at the end of last year, Xi Jinping hosted a conference with main recipients of the Belt and Road in Beijing. I think it was in November. And he did in his speech acknowledge that China needed to be more green in its projects and less corrupt in its projects, which, I think that was a good start. And then you might have seen, I'm trying to remember what the name of the group was. There was a European group this week. I read this in the Financial Times, I think, did a report making exactly suggestions like you just did, suggesting that there would be that there should be various ways to do a lot of these things in a greener way. I think what it would require is countries in the region also saying we just have to have greener projects. The dams that China built, not only in China but also several in Laos and in Cambodia, just really are ecologically very devastating and harmful. But I think you also have the benefit of China back home facing a lot of pressure from just the population getting tired of having dirty air, dirty water, and wanting more environmentally sound projects. And it's interesting that China now is only exporting its worst coal-fired plants to neighboring countries. They no longer can get away with doing this at home. So I think if some of the tensions were brought down a little bit, that maybe the U.S. and China could get back on the same page sort of on the same page under the Paris Climate Agreement. I think there would be ways to press China at the highest international levels, but then also working with countries. Laos, for example, they're now trying to build one more dam on the Mekong, and I don't know where they get off on these things. These things cost $2 billion. They have to repay this. And I didn't even go into the story where the electricity distribution company, Laos, in September had to turn over because of because of its massive debt to the Chinese, had to allow China Southern Power to take over their power grid, which is just unbelievable. And I can't believe that the international community, the IMF offered other solutions, but they did, in the end, they just did this. But they went with the Chinese, but I can't believe that Thailand and Vietnam, among others, wouldn't have just said, no, we're not doing this. We'll figure out ways to bail you out. But then they want to build another dam which the Thais are already saying, we're not going to. That's the other thing. You can get neighboring countries to put pressure on. So the Thais, after a dam burst in southern Laos 2 years ago, unfortunately, it wasn't built by the Chinese, it was built by the South Koreans. We needed that lever, but we didn't get it. The Thai population is saying, we no longer want hydropower electricity. Laos has lots of land, lots of mountains, lots of wind, lots of sun. Why don't solar is going down, the cost of solar is going down, the cost of wind's going down. Why don't we just introduce that stuff? And we will buy your power. And I think if we put pressure on countries like Laos and put pressure on the Chinese internationally and in the region, I think you could get quite a bit of traction to move ahead. But it would need a lot of persistence and coordination, I think. Yeah. Good question.
Thank you, Murray. I'm going to turn it over to Gregory Miller, who has the next question.
Thank you. Back in 2017, after the APEC meeting, Compass in Jakarta ran a front page story, Trump versus Z, Z wins. And from what you've said, it sounds like that hasn't changed very much, nor did the Trump administration seem to care. Should the US care, and what advice, whether we should or shouldn't, what advice would you give to the Biden administration on to enhance US influence in Southeast Asia?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's a little hard to make recommendations when you know that Biden's first priorities have to be to get control of COVID and get this economy going again, right? For so many that are just locked out, thanks to COVID and the shutdown that related from it. Yeah, the Southeast Asia really does want the U.S. to play a more active role. And when the U.S., when Congress passed the so-called BUILD Act about 2 or 3 years ago, $60 billion, and then set up this thing called, they turned the old OPEC into something called the Development Finance Corp, which obviously doesn't have a lot of money. It's around 60 billion, but it's at least a start. And they're able to do joint ventures with other countries like the Japanese or Aussies, let's say. They're also able to do joint ventures with private companies. So that might be a possible way to get involved. They were really bothered when the U.S. pulled out of when Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's not like that was going to be the mother of all platforms to trade on, but it showed the U.S. was involved, and it provided to Vietnam and Malaysia at least some alternatives to just depending so heavily on China. They were very disappointed. Trump only showed up at one East Asia summit meeting. This is something that follows immediately after the ASEAN and the November ASEAN meeting of leaders. They do have the East Asia Summit. Trump showed up once, actually only in Manila. He gave a speech and left before the meeting actually started. So they remember this stuff. For Southeast Asians, you know, you show you're interested by showing up. And the Trump guys, they didn't show up this year again, but it was after the election. But they sent to the ASEAN Summit and to the East Asia Summit, they sent O'Brien, the head of the National Security Council, an unconfirmed member of the Trump team, which, you know, is not the highest level. The year before, they sent him and, what's his name? Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, who also isn't the most dynamic secretary in Trump's cabinet. You know, so they really the Trump team has really not shown Southeast Asia that, except for the Pentagon. The Pentagon under Mattis initially, but continuing, has showed up. It did a lot of exercises. It did a lot of training. It kept going with you know, the exercises that have been going on for decades, and you know, tried to be helpful to countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines that have been wanting to that really don't have the wherewithal to see what China is doing in the South China Sea. So the beginning under the last few years of the Obama administration, the military start providing them with more military maritime domain awareness, radar, small boats, 25, 30-foot vessels that they could use to try to figure out what the Chinese were up to. So I think they need to get more involved economically, and if they could get involved in some infrastructure, that would be good. If they could, and they've just bid on the U.S. companies through this vehicle. The DFC have been bidding on some projects in Myanmar on renewable energy, but they're going to have to be more active. And the one thing that the Southeast Asians don't want is an all-out war, hot war, but even a cold war between China and Southeast Asia, because they provide so much input to the global supply chain, right? So Apple iPhones or a lot of the computers are assembled in China using technology from all over Southeast Asia. So they would not like to see that either. But yeah, get involved. And I think Biden's people, the people he's putting in the White House and in the State Department, assuming they get confirmed, are people that are more engagers than the guys who were under the Trump.
Thank you.
Thanks, Murray. We have one more question from Daniel Yonto, sorry about that. Before we turn to that, I should note that it is 1 o'clock. Those of you who needed to leave at 1, you're free to do so, but we will keep the conversation going for another 10, 15 minutes. I have time for that, and I hope you do as well. Murray, do you have time to stay for an extra 15 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Daniel.
Hi, Murray. I really do appreciate the country-by-country analysis. I thought it was really fascinating. However, you've been briefly mentioning ASEAN, and I'm curious to what extent ASEAN countries, sort of as a collective unit, have been able to influence China in the region.
Yeah, that is another whole topic I should maybe have gone into. One thing that has really hurt ASEAN's ability to stand up to China is that you need to have unanimity within the grouping before you can issue communiques, for example. So beginning in 2012, you might recall that that was the year that China had taken Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. ASEAN tried to issue a statement, and Cambodia was hosting ASEAN that year, and Cambodia by far is the country closest to China, and they had Chinese officials in some of the visiting rooms close to where the meeting was happening, and that Hornam Hong, who was then the foreign minister, probably one of Ben's favorite friends, Hornam Hong. No, I'm kidding, but. He would constantly go check with the Chinese, and in the end, they couldn't come up with a resolution, and that really has hurt the ASEANs a lot. Almost every year, there's an effort at bringing some just joint statement to criticize China for its behavior, and they can't do it because of China's ability to split off almost always Cambodia, and quite often Laos, and quite often Myanmar. Now, the thing that's going to be interesting is what's going to happen in the Mekong. This thing has really been heating up for most of 2020. And Vietnam tried to, I understand from Vietnamese diplomats, that they tried to raise this issue in ASEAN, thinking that maybe they would get more support from countries like Cambodia, Laos, and even Thailand, that doesn't care much about the South China Sea because it isn't a disputing country. But it really didn't work. But it's really interesting. There is something called, let's see if I can recreate it now. I don't use this word this acronym every day, but there is a UN Convention on non-navigable uses of rivers or something like that. I don't know exactly what it's called, but there are 18 countries in Asia, not only Southeast Asia, that for whom the source of their river begins in China. And if countries that are losing water because of China's taking it, keeping it, storing it, would all gang up, maybe is the right word. Maybe if they'd all cooperate and put pressure on China, not only a couple of little countries in Southeast Asia, but also Central Asia, South Asia, you might be able to get China to recognize, China says we have, if it begins in our country, we have rights of first use. That's your problem if you're further down. But I think China, if it wants to be a global player, is going to probably have to learn how to share its toys in the sandbox. And, I think that the Mekong does open up a whole new opportunity for getting countries like Cambodia. If Cambodian farmers, so China gives Cambodia and Laos all this aid, right? But if the cost to their farmers in rice and fish is far more than what they get from China in aid, are they going to want to keep doing this? It doesn't make any sense. So let's see what happens. But ASEAN, because it's based on consensus, has a lot of trouble putting a lot of pressure on countries unless everybody agrees.
Thank you for that.
Great. Our next question is from David Lindsay.
Yes, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. It's fascinating. And I want to ask you about something I heard from a scholar on Vietnam in this same lecture series a few years ago. He reported that many Chinese vessels were sinking Vietnamese fishing boats. It was 2018 or 19. And he said that the problem was that the Vietnamese government, the higher levels, were now basically on the Chinese government payroll. They had been bought out, and so they were not raising a fuss about this, and that there were actually demonstrations in the streets by fishermen and their friends and patriots, but that the Chinese government was turning a blind eye. Could you comment on whether there's some truth to this story or not?
So Vietnamese fishermen, there are two big groupings of islands in the South China Sea. The northern one is the Paracels, which the Chinese took from the Vietnamese in 1974. You might remember in 1974, the US-backed South Vietnamese government was still in power, and they took it from that government. The US let them do it because they were in the middle of normalizing relations. But now, it's really too late. The Chinese have now controlled it for years. So, but a lot of fishermen, Vietnamese fishermen from central and northern Vietnam go there, and they are regularly arrested. Some boats are burnt, some are sunk. Yes, they also sink boats of the Filipinos and Indonesians off their coasts. Every year, China puts in force a moratorium that divides the South China Sea, and any fishing north of that line is banned. It's at the 35th parallel, I think, if I recall. And so they do detain, sink, more detain, and then release after a while fishermen. But there are some sinking, that's for sure. Now, domestically, Hanoi has a really interesting situation. In 2018, Vietnam, in the middle of the year, the National Assembly of Vietnam tried to pass a law on special economic zones. That law didn't mention China once. But the population assumed that Chinese companies were going to get access to land. And the law said that a company that invests could keep the land for 99 years, while Vietnamese farmers can only keep their land for 50 years, and then they have to renegotiate and all that stuff. So the population went crazy and really did have huge protests, both in Hanoi and in the south. And in central Vietnam, some of them turned violent, and at Taiwanese steel mill in north central Vietnam, in Thanh Hoa rather, they attacked the steel mill that was being built by Chinese workers for this Taiwanese company, and 2 or 3 or so Chinese actually died in the process. The government recognizes fully that it's on a very short leash by the population. In 1997, the government gave a gypsum mine in central Vietnam to the Chinese, and even General Van Nguyen Giap, the general who helped win the war for the Vietnamese communists, he wrote a letter protesting the giving the Chinese access to this mine in central Vietnam, in the highlands, central highlands. There is, yeah, and you have academics, a lot of artists, a lot of people protest almost anything that the Vietnamese government does. Is the government sold out to China? No. They are standing up to China a lot. Sometimes they capitulate, but the Vietnamese, I got quite a bit of access in doing this book to party officials, and they said that in 2018, when China was putting a lot of pressure on this Spanish oil company called Repsol, there was the Politburo voted. I'm trying to remember, the Politburo was 17, is it? Do you remember, Eric? Is the Politburo 17 or 19 now? They've increased the numbers. I can't remember, but it's somewhere either 17 or 19. 2 officials voted to abandon the project with Repsol, which cost the Vietnamese $500 million. They owed Repsol around $500 million. Neither side has said exactly, but some economists have calculated it to have cost them that much. The party chief and the head of the military voted to abandon the project. The rest of the Politburo voted to stand their ground. But the 2 leaders did win in that case, and they abandoned the project. However, when China repeated this pressure last year, the Vietnamese no longer had a Spanish company, they had Repsol, which is a Vladimir Putin company, state-owned enterprise, and they don't stand down easily for anybody, as you would guess. And they didn't leave. And in the end, the Chinese just sort of wore out and left. It's a very complicated issue, but to say that Vietnam is taking no Belt and Road money. China has included a very disastrous project in it that started actually well before the Belt and Road. It's the SkyTrain in Hanoi, which has been built under construction for 10 years. The price keeps going up, and it's never going to be finished, I guess, if you're cynical. But the Vietnamese are doing the best they can, I would say, to stand up to China without going to war, which they know they can't afford. I don't know if that answers your question. I know it's rambling, but it's a very complicated issue in Vietnam.
No, that's great. Thank you.
I'll just add, Murray, I think you were definitely right on the money with your answer there. Also, with the recent Politburo change, it was 2016. I think it's actually the 12th Politburo, but there was a shuffling, and I think some of the consolidation of power that occurred used claims of the previous Prime Minister, Nguyen Tân Yum, claiming that he was in the pocket of the Chinese. Whether he really was or not is a very complicated thing to figure out, to be honest. But they certainly mobilized claims about that in justification to remove him. And the current leadership would certainly portray itself as strong against China. We have one last question from, I think it was Anita Ngai, was it? Anita, did you want me to read your question that you had posted, or did you want to read it out loud yourself? Or are you even still here? Anita, are you there?
She said, please go ahead. She writes.
Please go ahead. I missed it, the chat disappeared. So I'll read it, and you can see it yourself as well, Murray, but I'll read it quickly. Chinese FDI into the US has dropped a lot. How has the trend been into Southeast Asia? One key sector for the FDI is tech, and there's a list of tech companies. And then with tension high between Australia and China, has Australia been stepping up their involvement with ASEAN affairs? Given the time that we have, you can either answer both of them quickly or briefly,
Okay.
or one of them.
Yeah. Well, this year, obviously, Chinese investment has been hammered just because it's so hard to travel. There's no Chinese are going in and out. So it will be reduced, but this year. But I think generally, I would say Chinese investment has really started to take off. It was slow for a long time, but it's really started to take off. The Belt and Road, maybe it started very high. It's maybe going down, but general investment, including in technology, as you said, and as I noted, is still really going up. Australia, it's too early to really have seen Australia investment go up as a result of the wolf warriors going after Australia. But Australia has been, over the last 2 or 3 years, getting much more active in Southeast Asia, cooperating with Japan and others to play a bigger role in Southeast Asia, which is, as a middle power, Southeast Asia really appreciates Australia's role.
Thank you, Murray. With that, I think we're at the end of our allotted time. I want to thank you for such a fascinating discussion today. Obviously, you've opened so many doorways to further investigation as well, and I hope that this topic we can keep revisiting during this series. It occurred to me that it would be very interesting sometime in the future to organize a panel discussion, perhaps with you and Nayan Chanda, about the history of the Far Eastern Economic Review, or to hear about the time of your journalism, which was such an important time in developing on-the-ground knowledge about Southeast Asia. But we'll leave that for another time. I'll linger until people sign off and leave the chat open for a couple more minutes, but I just wanted to thank you formally, and I'll press stop on the recording right now.